Anthony Edwards has rapidly rose to one of the rising stars in the NBA and one of the most electric personalities out there. However, he has ruffled a few feathers of late with some interesting quotes sounding off on some of his stronger opinions about the history of the NBA. Paul George took to his own podcast to address Anthony Edwards' comments, have a bit of a pushback for the young fella, and kind of led this discussion about NBA history here. So I want to break down exactly what was said between both parties here, as well as some legitimate stars in the history of the NBA, like Magic Johnson chiming in on the topic of conversation as well. So let's get right into things here. And I'll start off with the initial quote that set things on fire by Anthony Edwards here. And he was asked about basketball back in the day, which he said, quote, "I didn't watch it back in the day, so I can't speak on it." Edwards said in an interview with Wall Street Journal, "They say it was tougher back then than it is now, but I don't think anybody had skill back then. Michael Jordan was the only one who really had skill, you know what I mean? So that's why when they saw Kobe, they were like, oh my God. But now everybody has skill." So the thing I first want to point out with this quote is you probably should have stopped right after the first sentence when you said, "I didn't watch it back then, so I can't speak on it." But nonetheless, he is Anthony Edwards, and these type of strong takes, this strong personality, is a great reason why people do like him. He is a personality, a trash talker, in a way that it is a throwback, a little bit similar to the old school days where guys were willing to take shots at others or speak negatively about other players in an open setting. There's so much buddy nowadays where all these friends, all these players are friends. They train together in the offseason, they vacation together, and there's nothing wrong with that in the grand scheme of things. That's just kind of the era that things have changed. But I do think Edwards is appealing to people because he's a bit of a throwback in that direction here. But Paul George did address the comments as well on his most recent podcast, saying, quote, "I thought it was kind of disrespectful to the game. I thought it was a very immature comment. How much the game has grown. You got to pay dues to the dudes that did it before us." And I do think Paul is right about this, that so much gets lost in the conversation, the comments like, playing against plumbers and things like that, which was made by JJ Redick there. The reality is there's no doubt that basketball is at a better place now than it ever was before. That the amount of skill in this game, when you think about players like Victor Wembanyama, who's 7'5" and putting the ball on the floor like that, the freaks of nature that we've seen being capable of stepping in from day one and making an impact on this game, the level of athleticism that every single player in the NBA is capable of. There's no doubt that there is a higher ceiling for how the game of basketball is played at, but that also shouldn't diminish the players that did make an impact back then. Because the reality is, there's a ton of players that you handpick them out of that 80s era or 70s era or 90s era or wherever you want to talk about and plug them into today's NBA, and they're still looking just fine. I guarantee you, pull Michael Jordan out of the 93 Bulls and drop him into whatever team in the NBA right now, and he's doing just fine. If you pull that version of MJ, he's going to be just fine. And I think that is true about these stars of just about every generation, that the style of basketball is much different in a way that I think is different from skill here. That there is a lot more fast paced nowadays. There's obviously way more 3-pointers that are leaned into. That's just not how the game was played back then. Even think back to the post-oriented nature that so many teams were built around. That wouldn't fly in today's NBA. And to kind of put a bit of a comparison here, think about a guy like Jahlil Okafor here in Philadelphia. It clearly did not work, and he was not an NBA player because of the style and the way that he played, and the guy just simply not having it. I do think if you take Jahlil Okafor and drop him back in a earlier era of NBA basketball, we're probably talking about him as one of the best players in the league because of how electric he would have been and how clearly that skill set would have translated here. Now, I think that's my bigger takeaway with the conversation. It has to do with a style thing, not a skill thing. But there were a couple other takes that I did want to dive into. And Magic Johnson, who of course played in that era of basketball, took some offense to this quote here. And it's this while sitting down with Stephen A. Smith, they had a conversation about it, and it says Johnson, a Lakers legend, gave his thoughts on the matter during a speaking appearance at an event in Los Angeles when media personality Stephen A. Smith brought up Edwards' comments. Quote, "I never respond to a guy that's never won a championship," Johnson said. "He didn't win a college championship. I don't even know if he won a high school championship." So I don't love this take, to be perfectly honest. It's fair to have the opinion, but I think this is more of a personal attack than taking the conversation as is. But a guy that I do give credit is Jamal Crawford for the way that he chimed in. So doing a little Ask Me Anything and got the question, what's your thoughts on Anthony Edwards' comments about MJ being the only skilled player from back then? And Jamal Crawford quote tweets it, said, "I got love for Ant. Love everything about him. But there is way more skilled players besides Jordan, LOL. On another note, a bigger conversation should be how it's been such a this or that culture, driven by media and social media, that now in this time period, people are questioning legends and pioneers of the game. It's one of the weirdest things out right now. I have a great deal of respect for Jamal Crawford, the way that he handles himself, the way that he calls a basketball game, and I do think he's a guy that should deserve a little more credit for steering things in the proper direction. That there's no doubt that we live in this hot take culture where everyone has to have an opinion on every little thing, that you want to compare things, that you have to have the argument of, is Pistol Pete as good as Luka Doncic, or who would be better if those were playing in that situation, when the reality is we'll never know the answer to those type of things. Now, you can have your opinion, you can make your argument, but I do think it is important to appreciate everyone that did pave the lane for this era of NBA basketball. It is unfortunate that I think Anthony Edwards, like, I guess the way I'll put it this way is I do think athletes always get the short end of the stick for that. That if you want, everyone wants them to be honest, but when they are honest and people disagree with them, it's an issue there. I think everyone loves Anthony Edwards because he is outspoken, because he says whatever he feels like, that he's willing to take shots at a guy and be this electric personality. But there's a limit on that for what people like as well. So I do think Ant's kind of finding his way for how to navigate that path. Still very young and still a guy very clearly coming up in the best years of his career. He took a massive step forward this year, but we should not be disrespecting the pioneers of who paved things. And just a reminder for how impressive the Michael Jordan legacy is. Did want to pull this up here. We're talking about a Hall of Famer who was a 14-time All-Star, a 3-time Steal champ, a 10-time scoring champ, 6-time NBA champion, 11-time All-NBA, 9-time All-Defensive Team, Rookie of the Year, 3-time All-Star MVP, 5-time NBA MVP, a Defensive Player of the Year, 6-time Finals MVP. The dude was legit. And I know this was not a shot at Jordan here, that there's very clearly respect to what he's brought to this game and the statistical ability that he was able to impact things, the rings that he put on his finger, all these things. But it was not just Michael Jordan that was carrying the load for what NBA basketball was during that period of time. Shout out to Jordan for taking things and putting on a map an extent in which I would not otherwise be the case, but I do think that it should not be diminished to these other guys. So to Anthony Edwards, maybe you do got to get in the lab, watch some tape, crunch the numbers, and see a little bit of a film back in the day. I think people will be surprised. Like, I don't think the gap in skill is nearly what it is made out to be. There is certainly no doubt that I think the top to bottom of the NBA is way deeper now. That I think, like, when you think about the top end talent back then, I think all of that pretty much translates. All those guys would be able to find a role in today's NBA. But I do think when you dig down and look deeper on rosters, and the guys that are rotational players may not be near the quality that we do see it today. But ultimately, everyone is allowed to have their opinion. Anthony Edwards certainly had his. I don't hate that Paul George is kind of sticking up for the game of basketball here. And by the way, when speaking about opinions, Paul George is a guy who plenty of young NBA players have called their version of the GOAT, which I think is crazy. I think is straight up wrong, but it is a testament to, I guess, the recency bias and why certain guys stand out to players in the way that others don't. So shout out to Paul George for getting a little love in that category there. I do like that Anthony Edwards continues to stir the pot a little bit here. I like that he's unapologetically him, that he lets it lets it fly from the hip and keeps people talking. So eventually I think people will fully turn on that and he will become a little bit more of the villain arc. But for now, I still think it falls in the likable category, and I think this will be something that he completely navigates here. But let me know what you guys think on the comments. Do you think Paul George was out of line sticking up for things? Do you agree with Anthony Edwards, or any other takes that you do have below? Also, make sure you're smashing that subscribe button, dropping a like on this video, any comments you have below, and I'll be talking with you next time right here on Sixers Digest. Peace.